Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Please bear with us as we allow everyone to enter from the waiting room. We'll just take a moment. Thank you again for joining us. Just a moment longer and we will start. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is the second in a series of our conference on the post-pandemic era here with School Choice. I would like to now introduce our director for the program on education policy and governance here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Professor Paul E. Peterson. Paul?
Welcome to our conference on school choice in the post-pandemic era. We are holding this conference as a series of webinars so that everybody can participate without too much of their day being absorbed by this on any given day. We're going to be holding this weekly from 12 to 1 Fridays through December 10th. I am Paul Peterson. I am the director of the program on education policy and governance, and we're thrilled to have so many people joining us today for our special event featuring the president of the American Federation of Teachers, Randi Weingarten, and the senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Jay Greene. The conference is inspired by many of the changes that have occurred in American education over the past year, and we don't know how lasting these changes are going to be or how they're going to influence the trajectory of American education in the next decade. But we do want to look at the question of school choice in a period when parents are much more involved with their children's education than ever before. So in today's session, our speakers are going to consider what educational options families should be offered in the post-pandemic era. And I want to get to our speakers as soon as possible, but first I wish to recognize Antonio Wentland, Nick Tavares, and Michael Poor, who've carried the heavy administrative and technical workload for the conference. And let me just mention that you can view a recording of each session of the conference on the PEPG website. It'll be posted as soon after today's session as possible. Now, let me introduce the co-moderator of our conference, Daniel Hammond, who is a professor of education at the University of Oklahoma. He's an expert on school choice, and he's helped to organize the conference. He and I are going to share the duties of moderator during the session today. So, Daniel, I'm turning the floor over to you.
All right, well, thank you, Paul. As Paul noted, today we really have a great opportunity to hear from two speakers with a vast knowledge of issues in school choice and school systems generally. So our first panelist is American Federation of Teachers President Randi Weingarten. She, of course, leads the 1.7 million member organization, and she's been the AFT's president since 2008. Prior to that role, she served for 11 years as president of the United Federation of Teachers, which represents approximately 200,000 educators in the New York City public school system. She was included in the Washingtonian's 2021 list of Washington's most influential people. In 2017, she received the Roosevelt Institute's FDR Distinguished Public Service Award. And in 2013, the New York Observer also named her one of the most influential New Yorkers of the past 25 years. And there's much more to say. Our second panelist is Jay Greene. He's Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He previously served as Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. He's one of the country's leading experts on education policy, and he's published a great deal of influential research on a broad range of topics, including school choice, but also character education and values, and also on the misuse of social science research and policy debates. He's also written the best-selling book, Education Myths. Again, there's much more to say about both these panelists, but we want to hear from them. So Before we jump in, just as a quick note to the audience, we want to interact with you. We want to hear from you. We want to get your questions. So please do pose your questions. There's a separate chat just for questions. And if you can just post those succinctly with a question mark after them, that will allow Paul and I to identify those questions and pose them to each of the presenters. So with that, we're going to start. Each presenter will have 5 minutes to give their initial thoughts on our session question, which is what school options should families have in the post-pandemic era? And then after they give their initial remarks, we'll have some time for them to respond to each other's comments. So Randi, if I may, would you please start us off?
Thank you. Thank you, Doc. And thank you, Paul. And thank you, Jay. And look, I'm honored to be here. And, it would not normally be, a session that you would have invited me to. So I'm really quite honored. So since the beginning of August, I've visited scores of public schools. And when I say scores, I actually mean upwards of probably 50 public schools in 20 states and territories, 30 different localities. And I'm saying that because from Petaluma to Puerto Rico, the joy that students and staff have felt to be back in school has been palpable. The relief I have seen on parents' faces, it's consistent with the survey work we've done with parents, others have done with parents, Rand has done with parents, and it shows that parents have overwhelmingly wanted in-person instruction, but they want the protections, the safety protections, masks, vaccines, ventilation. I know this is not 100%, but I'm talking about strong majorities. And frankly, my visits to schools have been quite different than what you see playing itself out in terms of school boards and state legislators. And it's been pretty cognitively dissonant what I've seen in schools versus what you see in terms of these meetings. But the joy and the return to some kind of normalcy doesn't mask, no pun intended, the fact that students are returning with immense needs, anxiety, depression, effects of social isolation, trauma, loss, stress, academic and physical needs. And so to kind of answer your question, for this year, this is a year for kids' recovery and frankly, revival. It's a moment to create safe, welcoming, and supportive environments in every school. Notice what I said, every school, not every public school, every school. So we can help kids not only recover from the disruptions of the past 20 months, but to thrive. So educators are trying to help kids learn how to be with each other again, how to build relationships, how to build resilience, how to think critically, how to be confident, how to be curious, how to be hopeful, how to be healthy. And I empathize, because of the pandemic has affected everyone. I empathize with parents trying to figure out what kind of schooling they want for their kids. And for starters, it's clear that most parents have wanted their kids back in person 5 days a week, but I have been quite critical of districts like New York City or Chicago that haven't put a remote option there, as limited as maybe it is, but because kids have not been vaccinated yet. And there's a lot of parents, particularly Black and brown parents, who are concerned about the safety issues. This is the place where you would probably find me consistent with what I've said before. The percentage of children attending public schools virtually unchanged since before the pandemic, around 90%. And frankly, I expected a far higher percentage of families to opt temporarily or otherwise to homeschool their kids or to enroll them in private or virtual schools, given the fears about COVID and the volatile debates about safety protocols. But from what I've seen, even with the Charter School Association's work, it's a pretty small change from what I expected it to be. I expected it to be higher. But what it says to me is that families are valuing public schools and what a good public school is for academics, of course, but as centers of communities where kids eat healthy meals, access healthcare, and find social and emotional supports. The pandemic has changed many things in our lives. Did it change the school options families have in a post-pandemic era? For me, it's not the question of school choice versus no school choice, but what kind of school choice and to what ends. And as you know, there is a robust history of public school choice in the United States. You know this better than I do. Neighborhood public schools, magnet schools, community schools, interdistrict choice plans, public schools with special focus, arts, STEM, IB schools, career and tech ed. In fact, I actually taught in a career tech ed school. And there are decades as well, as you know, of performance of voucher and charter schools. And no doubt, everybody's going to interpret the data the way they want to interpret it. But this is, I have about a minute left. This is the question that I would actually ask all of you to consider, because we both have different views of this evidence. If you really believe in school choice, I would ask you to work to ensure public schools are a viable choice, to support the investments in public schools to strengthen them, not to defund them or not to make them unattractive. So my suggestion is this: why don't we look at what we can do this year in all these different sites, in all these different programs? Come back together again and see pragmatically what is and what is not working. What worked in private schools? I learned a lot about testing from what was working in private schools last year, about COVID testing. What worked in religious schools? What works in charters? What doesn't work? Why don't we try to have a different conversation? Listen to parents about what they need, support teachers in trying to help in students' recovery, take on issues together like the teaching of history or making sure every child has broadband or internet devices at home. Change the accountability system so that public schools can do project-based instruction, which is one of the appeals of private schools. Research together the long-term implications of the pandemic, of remote instruction, of isolation. What I've learned, and I'll stop here, schools are not a commodity, they're a public good. And I believe we have to act in that manner. But we need to do things other than this public health crisis. We're experiencing a crisis in our democracy in which our public schools have a really important role. Why not try to figure out how to make this year, regardless of where we are, a year of recovery and revival for our kids, and not have a year of winners and losers? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randy. Well, we'll turn things over to Jay now. Jay?
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Paul, for organizing this. Thanks, Randy, for participating in this discussion. I similarly have some comments that I'd like to read, and I think they should take about 5 minutes, and I hope I make them engaging enough reading to you. But what I'd like to say is that public schools have been sticking it to many low-income and minority students since they were founded. Public schools have been segregated for most of their history by law. Even after state-compelled segregation was ended, public schools continue to be highly segregated because district boundaries were drawn with red lines separating communities by race. Outcomes for low-income and minority students remain abysmal despite huge increases in school spending, now exceeding $15,000 per pupil. Public schools have been able to get away with this shocking miseducation of disadvantaged students because, despite all of their failings, public schools have managed to serve upper income families reasonably well. As long as the public school system can maintain the support of the advantaged families, the disproportionate political power of wealthier families protected public education from fundamental restructuring, including a significant expansion in school choice. Upper income families could pick suburban school districts that gave them what they wanted and permitted greater parental input. The fact that wealthier families often supplemented their children's education with enriching activities outside of school also helped mask any deficiencies in the quality or content of those suburban public schools. These arrangements engendered a high level of affection for public education among these wealthy and disproportionately powerful families, despite reports of severe difficulties in large urban school districts. With limited direct experience of the dysfunction of urban public education, wealthy families were willing to believe that the problem stemmed from a lack of funding or from societal ills beyond the power of schools to control. Advantaged families were strongly disinclined to risk any disruption in their comfortable arrangements because of problems for other people's children, especially when they could seize upon spending or social problems as rationalizations to leave the status quo intact. The pandemic dramatically changed these political dynamics when the public education system failed to deliver what many advantaged parents wanted. Specifically, the public system broke faith with upper income families by flagrantly resisting in-person instruction, prioritizing the needs of union members over those of parents. In addition, remote learning allowed upper income families to see the instruction that their children were receiving, and many were shocked by its low quality and radical content. As suburban families organized to object to their radical content to their local school boards, they were further shocked to discover how unresponsive those school districts had become. And when the Biden administration, with union support, issued a letter orchestrating an effort by the FBI and government agencies to investigate protesting parents as potential domestic terrorists, the inability of even wealthy parents to control the public education of their own children was laid bare. Education is an extension of parenting, and parents want significant control over how their children are raised and educated. The current arrangements of the public education system survived because wealthy parents believed they had that control. Once it was revealed that they also lacked this control, they mobilized politically to regain the autonomy they desire. This resulted in an enormous increase in educational choice over the last year, creating 7 new programs and expanding 21 existing ones in 18 states. School choice is a one-way ratchet. Once people have experienced an expanded set of options, they are very resistant to having those options taken away. In addition, the broken faith between the public system and the advantaged families will take a lot of time and effort to restore, even after schools return to in-person instruction and disputes over masks and vaccines fade. This means that the potential political pressure for further expansions of school choice remains strong for the foreseeable future. This last year has given us a glimpse of the future, and that future contains a lot more school choice. Because education is an extension of parenting and because parents are best situated to raise their own children, all parents should have control over where and how their children are educated. It is a shame that it took a pandemic and bad political miscalculations on the part of the unions to make advantaged families experience the same feeling of being out of control that poor families have long felt. But now that wealthier families are getting on board for school choice, all families can benefit from its expansion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jay. I did notice among our attendees, there are some hands up. I just remind people to go ahead and post their questions in the Q&A box. That would be great for us. There are a large number of people in attendance, so that's the way we can find your questions. So now we'll just pivot, and I'd like to give Randi and Jay an opportunity to respond to each other's comments. We've kind of envisioned this as more of a dialogue, and then from there we'll move to ask a few questions. They'll be from Paul and I and also the audience. Randi, do you want to get us started? You're muted.
All right. Look, what Jay does not disappoint in his consistent undermining of other people's points of view, including who unions are and what we have tried to do as part and parcel of getting schools reopened. So just as a point of personal privilege, the AFT put out the first report of any organization, private or public, about how to reopen schools in April 2020. And we had done all of this work and begged the Trump administration to help us with the resources that the Biden administration has done. And so at the end of the day, teachers have wanted to be in school, understood how important it is. And so if we're going to change the trajectory and the way in which things are talked about and how we actually help our kids in America, what I'm trying to do by being here today is change the way in which we do this conversation. You notice in my first comments, I didn't attack anybody. I talked about what we needed to do for children. And Jay, I would just ask you to try to do the same things instead of immediately union teachers, this and that. Teachers wanted to be in school and they're glad to be in school. Number two, we have actually worked with a lot of parent groups, minority parent groups including LULAC, NAACP, groups representing Asian American parents, and done various different polling over the course of the last several months. And we have been very transparent about putting these out. So in May, I put out, when we called for all schools to be reopened for the summer and for the fall, we put out this polling that we had done with NAACP and with LULAC and these other groups. Just FYI, parents said that they were highly satisfied with the job that their children's school had done dealing with the pandemic. 85% were satisfied, a 9-point gain from where they were over the summer of 2020. 81% said their children's schools were providing good in-person instruction. Parents actually worried about the infection rates and things like that. They were fearful about health and safety. But I was actually kind of surprised because of all of the disinformation and all of the kind of chaos that what we were seeing was what I had heard anecdotally about the real connection you had seen between parents and their school's teachers. Now, was the pandemic a problem in terms of the deconstruction of all of life? Yes. And could all of us have done a better job if we had, if we had a way of knowing what was going on? Yeah, of course. But what I'm looking at right now is, what do we do today? And the last thing I'm going to say is this. The issue, and maybe I say this as a social studies teacher, and I was really glad to see the Koch brothers come in and do this intervention in this way. There are not both sides of the Holocaust. There's not both sides of the Holocaust. There are not both sides of slavery. And we have an obligation when it comes to issues of teaching history to find ways. Yes, we have to do it in K-12 through curriculum that has been peer reviewed. But I think we have an obligation to all children, to our society at large, to teach these things and not further fracture. And the letter that the National School Board sent, I read that letter, I talked to them. It was about not dissent, but about actual violence. If we allow and enable bullying and violence, and I say this as someone who has been on a front line of doing demonstrations, if we enable and allow violence as opposed to real conversations with each other, then it really threatens our way of life. And I don't care if we're conservatives or liberals or Democrats or independents or who we are. We have to come together on those issues.
Jay?
Sure. So I'll try to be brief because I think the faster we get to bringing everyone into the discussion, the better. Look, my comments were focused really on trying to understand why there was a huge expansion in educational choice last year, and to foresee for in response to the prompt of this discussion, to foresee where the future of school choice is. And I think the future of school choice looks quite bright because I think some of the political obstacles to it have been reduced because of how people experience, particularly advantaged families experience the pandemic. And I think that these are observations of the political situation. And I think that would be productive for us to discuss whether we're seeing the same kind of political dynamics and whether we see the same political future, because I think that regardless of how we feel about it, I think there's quite a lot of momentum for school choice. And I think it has to do with the mobilization of middle and upper middle class families because of experiences that they had during the pandemic.
So let me ask the first question of Randi, and I'd like her to comment on the fact that before the pandemic, it looked like the school choice movement was in trouble, on the ropes. There was divisions within it. There was slowdown of the opening of new charter schools. But during the course of the pandemic, this seems to have changed somewhat because you've now got a number of legislatures passing new legislation, opening up the private schools to low-income families through tax credits and other kinds of innovations. And you're seeing the charter sector reporting growth in student enrollments. Homeschooling is really up by, I don't believe the report from the Census Bureau saying 11%, but there's a lot of other data out there saying that the number of homeschoolers has increased. Now, all of this could be temporary. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is coming into the future. But what do you think is the best way for school districts to respond to these challenges that have seemed to have emerged?
Well, I think there's four things. Number one, in looking at some of the data, so you had the Espinoza case in the Supreme Court, which created a revival, frankly, not in, if you look at the places where there's been an expansion of vouchers and charters, it's basically very ideologically driven. It's basically in the states where you had a Republican or a conservative trifecta. I'm just saying what the facts seem to suggest. But the second thing is, and this was very interesting to me, when I actually went into and tried to go into the data, Paul, that the Charter School Association put out. And by the way, remember, the Charter School Association had actually invited me to speak at the Charter School Association last year. And then there were a bunch of right-wingers who basically told them to pull the invitation, and they pulled the invitation. Because as many of you know, I actually run a charter school. Al Schenker was one of the first progenitors of charter schools. And the charter school I run in the South Bronx has a pretty good reputation and has a pretty good graduation rate, and it's a public charter school. But if you look at the data, the big winner, the homeschooling and the virtual schooling has been the huge increase last year in terms of growth. And the real question becomes right now, where parents are going to be on this whole issue of reintegration of their kids into society. And I don't think any of us, you know, I have poll results, you have poll results, we have anecdotal pieces, but I would hope that what we'll see is more and more kids being in person and not so socially isolated. I think that's far better for kids. And there's lots of reasons why there was homeschooling instead of the, you know, school system remote option, or Stride instead of the school system remote option. But I don't think we can draw any conclusions on that yet. And but because I think we're going to see what parents are going to do in terms of school systems. Last thing, and I know we have debates about this, and I will point to the evidence that shows that more funding does actually work, and Paul and Jay will point to the evidence that it doesn't. But this is what I think school systems need to do. I think we should have in school systems broad public school choice. As I said, I taught at a career tech ed school, Clara Barton High School. I taught AP government, and my kids, you know, competed in Bill of Rights competitions. I think we need to have lots of different pathways for kids within the public and within public schools. But what we absolutely have to have are neighborhood public schools where parents want to send their kids, educators want to work, and kids thrive. I think this whole notion of how we rebuild community is really, really important in America. I go back to de Tocqueville and how we do the twin goals of finding the common interest and the common bonds, as well as honoring our diversity.
Jay, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think that there are public goals from facilitating education, and there's quite a lot of research on this, that private schools are actually on average, better at producing those goals than traditional public schooling, which is ironic because public schooling was developed in large part to achieve those goals. So we see higher rates of civic participation, volunteering, and higher rates of political tolerance among students who are in or went to private schools than in traditional public schools. And so the public good can be very well served through a system of choice in education, as it is in many other realms of our life where we achieve the public good through systems of private choice. And then on the issue of spending, I guess the only thing I would add is that new NAEP results just came out from the long-term NAEP that show for the first time a significant decline across the board in age on the long-term NAEP. Now going on for several years, and this despite huge increases in per pupil spending. So per pupil spending is now well north of $15,000, and this was occurring as those results are dropping. I also think overall we might agree that the aggregate outcomes are disappointing from our education system, and so I'm just wondering how much money would be enough to finally produce the satisfactory outcomes if we think that money is the main obstacle. I suspect it's not. I think there's actually quite a lot of evidence, including this overall experience of NAEP scores and school spending, to suggest that actually it's the institutional arrangements and incentives of our education system that have been producing disappointing outcomes, not lack of resources.
So Jay, let me ask you this question. There's been a lot of movement to online learning inevitably this past year, but it's not clear that students benefited from online learning anywhere near to the same extent that they benefit from in-person learning. And Randi has really emphasized the importance of getting students back into the schoolhouse, into the classroom. The choice movement has been celebrating virtual schools as sort of an alternative that should be exploited out there. But do you really think that's a good idea? And what's the place of online learning in education as we emerge from the pandemic?
Sure. So I think virtual schooling is very good for certain students and very bad for other students. So one of the beautiful things about school choice is that people get to find the methods of delivery and content that actually works best for them. And there are excellent virtual school operators out there that are doing a very good job. I think part of the problem that occurred during the pandemic is that almost all schools were forced into providing virtual schooling, including many schools that were not good at that, had very little interest in it and made very little effort at making it better. And that was a big part of why virtual schooling was so disappointing for the average parent, is that they were getting virtual schooling from non-virtual operators that were not focused on being excellent at virtual schooling. Those entities that are focused on virtual schooling can do an excellent job of it for the students who benefit from that method of delivery.
So Randi, do you have a comment on that?
So, look, there are going to be parents all across America who have decided before and will decide again that homeschooling or virtual schooling is what they want. The K-12 Inc. Performance, they now call it Stride, is nothing that most investors would want to invest in. So the issue about, I would just say that on this issue, we've just had this huge, big experiment because of a pandemic about whether or not virtual schooling was the, was the new panacea. And I would say that if you talk to any parent, forget, for example, about the employment issues and women leaving the workplace and all sorts of other things. Let's forget about all the other social issues. I would just say that common sense and the push for kids to have a place to go and to be in relationship and to be with other kids and to have that kind of learning resilience and all of these other things that kids learn in, together, that is more important than any of the stats that any of us will talk about. I do, though, want to answer one. So I'm a big believer in in-person learning. And I will also tell you that we as a union, because we represent lots of nurses and lots of educators, we went back to our offices in August. We actually have a vaccine mandate for our workers. We actually have vaccine and test to make sure that everybody is safe. We had the medical and the religious exemptions, and we gave people leaves so that they come back if they decided not to vaccinate and they didn't get a medical or religious exemption. So we are kind of walking our own talk here about being in person and what that means. But I do want to say one thing, Jay, if I may, Paul, about something that Jay said about political for pluralism and what happens in private schools. The high school and middle school social studies, science teachers, English teachers, I know, we have been begging to have an accountability system like one sees in private schools, in that we would be able to move away from a 20 or 30 year fixation on testing and move towards the kind of project-based instruction that we see working so well in career tech ed schools, where you have like a 95% graduation rate of kids, where, and move to something like that in our other middle and high schools. Because I do think, Jay, you are right, that there is that, and in terms of action civics, part of what happens in a private school is that there is a lot more time to be very engaged actively, not ideologically in terms of Democrat or Republican, but engaged in terms of civic participation, in terms of service learning. And that's the kind of space and time we need in public schools. So you're right, it's not just about money, but there's a whole bunch of reports. We could go back and forth in terms of the reports. There's a lot of reports that have shown a correlation, particularly with poor kids, about money mattering. But what I'm saying is that it's more than money. We really do need a different accountability system and assessment system, so we're not tethered to everything being about a test. We really have to create the muscle of civic participation that you see in so many private schools.
There's a lot of questions in the chat here about choice and the management of, some of them are related to the management of choice. And I guess I'm thinking of cities where maybe you have tax credit scholarships and vouchers and charter schools and maybe online schools, or districts that run their own parallel online schools, as well as, of course, inter-district choice. So, of course, there's some arguments that this should be managed in some way. And there have been numerous proposals out there for what should be done in these types of cities across the country. I was wondering if maybe we could start with Jay, what your view is on this, and then turn to Randy.
So I don't think it's wise to have portfolio management or quarterbacking or whatever the current term is for this institutional arrangement, because it's really developing one ring to rule them all. And again, the advantage of choice is that we don't want a single entity to tell parents how to raise and educate their own children. We think parents are best situated to make that judgment for their own families. And that's what choice facilitates. And you undercut that when you manage that. There's also some really good evidence, by the way, that that the more you increase centralized management, actually the more, again, that you discriminate against minority operators of schools. So it's comparable to occupational licensure, that when you increase barriers to entry to an occupation, like hair braiding or something like that, it disproportionately and negatively affects minority entrance into that occupation. And the same is true in education, that the more we increase artificial and not educationally productive barriers to entry, the more we keep out minority school operators that may serve minority populations of students particularly well.
So Randy, do you have a comment on? You're muted.
One of these days, one will learn. But as I said, I don't want you to hear the construction site right next to us. So there's, look, I'm a public school person who believes, as did my predecessors, that we need to have lots of public options for kids and for their parents. That every school and every public option should be a good school. And I've seen some in the chat. I think that this sense of assuming that there would be a steady state in public schooling, but you could do all sorts of changing in terms of private options. I think I would ask the people in the chat to kind of reconsider the logic of that. I mean, I do think we have to constantly, and this year is a year like no other, in terms of really thinking about how we wrap services around schools. I mean, look, Jeff Cannon and I have done a lot of work together this year about how we help kids, regardless of circumstances, regardless of where they're going to school, how we help deal with the emotional and social issues that have happened because of the social isolation, and how we figure out how to do this in neighborhoods. And we've been working on that in terms together. So the issue becomes, there are some economies of scale that will really be helpful. There are, in a school system, if you can have lots of magnets, and a big school system like New York City, you know, magnets and different kinds of middle and high school options, it would be pretty neat. But I think that the key here is, in every public system, you have to have a neighborhood public school that parents feel comfortable with, that has a safe and welcoming environment. And then if parents want to make other choices, they make other choices. The issue that we have is, I would argue, that you cannot rob Peter to pay Paul. I would argue that the public choices have to be invested fully and frontally, first and foremost, to do that. You would argue something differently, Jay and Paul. But the point is, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that every neighborhood public school works effectively. I do agree with Jay that all of these different kind of quasi, it looks like a market, but it isn't a market, doesn't really, you know, the public schools have to decide. We are not markets. Yes, we have to be high performers, but there is a fundamental choice here, no pun intended, that I believe, and I think most parents in America and most people in America believe, that public education is a public good that should be available for all. And it's not a market. But, you know, I understand that you have a different ideological viewpoint than I do, and I'm not going to convince you of that, and you're not going to convince me of that. So what do we do to, and from my perspective, how do we make sure that the public system is as great as it can be so that there are public choices for every school child in America, Indigenous, Black, brown, trans, white, rich, poor, middle class. And that's what I have focused on in my career.
Jay, so what about that? Why not dig in and ensure that every neighborhood school is as good as it possibly can be?
So, I mean, first, I think that actually there's some area of agreement here that I have with Randi, and it's important to emphasize that as she's been doing too. My argument here is not primarily an ideological argument for markets. My argument is about conceiving of education as an extension of parenting, and that parents should be front and center in raising and educating their own children, which means that they have to have options for how and where they educate their children that suit the way that they need to raise their own children. And so the state's interest in helping parents do that is not the same as an interest in an institution called a public school. A public school might be one mechanism for helping parents raise their own children, but it isn't the only or necessarily best mechanism. And so our primary goal is not the investment in any one system, but is the investment in families so that they're empowered to make choices among options that may include public schools, but that's not really the main point of assisting families.
So Jay, this all sounds good, but in rural areas, if you start dividing up schools that people are going to go to, how are you going to ensure that you have any schools that are going to be capable of providing a decent education to their students? You don't find a lot of enthusiasm for school choice in small towns and in rural communities where the local public school is an institution that serves everybody in the community. I remember going to such a school myself, and it was unthinkable to bust up that school. So how do you respond to the concerns that parents have about the need for a common institution within their community?
Sure, and part of why I think rural schools are serving families pretty well, and why families are not particularly agitating for school choice in rural areas, is that those schools are highly attentive to their needs because they're highly reflective of the way that they wish to raise their own children. That is, people have geographically chosen where they live in part, and live in communities where they have a shared vision of how they want to educate their children. And that's often the case in rural schools. And I see nothing wrong with that. And I just as I think we should support families, we should also support communities, including rural communities, in educating their own children. Now, at the same time, I don't think we should build our entire school system around a relatively small number of rural children who would largely be unaffected by expanding school choice, because perhaps most would be content to stay where they are, which is just fine. Now, for those who are not content to stay where they are, they do have options. As it turns out, there are not significant economies of scale in education. Micro schools are quite efficient, even in rural areas, and virtual schooling is also an option in rural areas. And so we want to allow communities to stay intact, but also if there are individuals who wish to have alternatives, they should be able to obtain them so that they can raise their children in the way they prefer.
So may I just interject? I spend a lot of time doing with rural schools. We just worked for the last 10 years on a project called Reconnect McDowell, and where we were asked by the then governor's wife and governor to take over that public school system. And we said, we believe in public schools. We will collaborate, we will run the not-for-profit project, but we're not taking over a public school system. This is a school system, a rural system that have been taken over by the state. I raise this because, Jay, these are not the problems that are going on in rural America. The problems of poverty, the problems of no jobs, the problems of being abandoned, frankly, by markets. And frankly, what's happening in rural schools, I just pulled out this article, sorry, The Tragedy of America's Rural Schools, that was in the New York Times. What's happening is they have huge funding issues. They have huge issues in investment, in social, emotional issues in terms of communities. One of the things that keep them together, though, is this sense that the school is a community foundation. And what ended up happening in McDowell over these last 10 years is we have doubled the college entrance rates and achievement rates. We have raised graduation rates by 20 points. We now have actually built teacher and physician housing in the middle of Welsh. Not that I want to be in the business of building housing, frankly, but we are trying to do what actually Paul just said, which is how do you recreate kind of the cohesiveness of these institutions in a place where there's been a lot of abandonment? How do you get back and find a way to seduce jobs, and I say seduce intentionally, jobs back to a community where many of the kids are living with their grandparents, not their parents anymore? And so I think that what you're seeing in rural America in terms of this push to actually keep their public schools is that it is one of the remaining viable institutions that help create community. And I hear from rural parents and from my members all the time about how do we find the way to invest and deal with all of the social, emotional, and economic issues that the others have abandoned.
So if I could quickly respond, I mean, there's something slightly amusing about someone in New York quoting the New York Times to me in Fayetteville, Arkansas, about what people in rural America are thinking about. Yes,
Jay,
I think rural communities are.
Have you read the article? Before you say that, have you read the article?
I actually have not.
Okay, so you know,
but I don't regularly read the New York Times for various good reasons. But I'd be happy to take a look. But what I can say is, again, that rural communities are relatively happy on average with current school arrangements, and I see no reason to disrupt that. And nothing that I'm talking about would disrupt that. I think what we're largely talking about are reforms that would affect suburban and urban education, where, by the way, the lion's share of all children are. And so I see this as a kind of digression into a relatively tangential issue. Rural education need not be affected by expansion of school choice. Largely because people are likely to continue choosing their existing arrangements.
Well, let me change the subject to this issue of school segregation, which Jay raised at the beginning, and ask Randy if you think that this is correct, that public education in the United States has been a system that has segregated students and undermined equal opportunity, and that school choice is needed to change that. Is that an accurate characterization of where we are today? You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I don't think so. But I think that, look, I think that there's a history here about how choice was, or that some of the first people, I want to be very careful, because there are good people who believe in lots of things to help our kids. So I want to be very, very careful here. but there is a lot of history that the first people who pushed for choice were doing it in response to Brown versus Board of Education and not wanting to have integration in schools. And I think we have to be careful about acknowledging that history and owning that history and trying to change that history in a real way. That's number one. Number two, it's housing and it's economics that have created the kind of segregation that we have in lots of different places. And, you know, it would be good to change housing patterns and transportation patterns and lots of different things. I mean, if you talk to Milwaukee, the African-American parents who have started a community organization in Milwaukee called Block, and you walk with them through the blocks of Milwaukee, and you see the transportation issues and the housing issues. And so, you know, there's a lot of those things that we have to deal with. I do think that there were a whole bunch of ways of trying to disrupt segregation, and that's important. And magnet schools are some of it, and other things are ways of doing that. But I don't think that I don't see any evidence anywhere that things that the charter or voucher movement has actually increased integration. In fact, what I've seen a bunch of data that says the opposite.
Jay, would you like to follow up on that?
Sure. So actually, I think the evidence is pretty clearly in the other direction, which is if you detach schooling from housing, you increase the opportunities for people to mix across neighborhoods. And you also reduce the segregation in housing because, again, the more that housing is attached to schooling, the more segregated by income and race it's likely to be. This is both empirically demonstrated and theoretically sound. And so part of the advantage of school choice is to improve people's ability to cross lines because they're not compelled to go to a school based on where a red line drawn district boundary was made. Now, that being said, I mean, this balances against the discussion we were just having about desire for community. People also wish to be in communities and wish to share certain perspectives and educational approaches and with their neighbors, and that's a legitimate desire too. But again, school choice can facilitate both of these, both voluntary community and voluntary crossing of boundaries between communities so that people can obtain the kind of education they want.
Well,
All right.
we're running out of time here, and I want to give both of you an opportunity for a final word. So Randi, would you like to start?
So first, let me also just again say thank you for having this conversation. You know, at the end of the day, education is a key opportunity agent for our kids, is imperative for our economy. And frankly, I do think that it is a way of recreating the beloved community that is actually necessary to nurture democracy, regardless of our ideology. So having a conversation, I think, is really important. Showing the muscle of that conversation and that civitas is really important. We will just say, I think this year is a year of recovery and revival for kids. And that at the end of the day, from my perspective, there needs to be a bunch of choice in terms of public schooling. I do agree with Jay that the magnets and others have actually helped intentionally create more integration in a public school setting. But we need to have a both and. In a public school setting, particularly one as big as New York City, you need to have both a great neighborhood school as well as, I would argue, other kind of public school options. That's what the taxpayers pay for. They should get value in it. And most importantly, parents should have places that they want to send their kids to school. Educators want to work as a true professionals and the amazing people that they have been, particularly during this pandemic. And most importantly, kids thrive.
Jay.
I also want to thank Randy for participating in this conversation, and for to Paul and Dan for helping organize this. I think it's very useful to have us understand each other better, and I'm learning a lot from this conversation. So thanks to all of you for participating. But I do have to say that the main thing that we, I think, should take away from observing the political landscape post-pandemic is that in some ways it doesn't matter what we say to each other here. There is a dynamic going on out there that is occurring regardless of what we say or do. This is not within the control of our conversation or advocacy organizations of any kind. And what's going on is that parents want to raise their own children. And the relatively powerful, wealthy families that thought they were able to raise their own children very effectively under traditional arrangements have discovered that they weren't able to do it as well as they thought. And they're seeking alternatives. And as they seek alternatives, the existing structures are being remade. And that's occurring regardless of what we say. And this will continue going forward because, again, as people experience expanded options, they don't readily give them up. They very much like them. They're going to keep them. And we should recognize the power asymmetry again here, that advantaged families are going to drive this forward. But I think it has potential to benefit all families as the set of options are expanded to include much broader educational choice, as we did see during the last legislative session, and as I expect we're going to continue to see going forward. Thanks.
Well, thank you both. Daniel, do you have a final word?
No, just of course, thanks to Jay and Randy. I'll just mention very quickly here, a common thread in the chat here at the end is that folks really appreciated being able to hear sort of two different perspectives on these important issues. So thank you so much. And we'll be here next week at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.